WBT.
Huh? It's 5:05 and welcome into a Friday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Happy November 1st to you. Starting off our program this morning, we have more updates out of Western North Carolina. Hurricane Helen severely damaged over 200 child care facilities across a 25-county area out in Western North Carolina. Take a listen to this. 55 of those 200 facilities are unlikely to reopen anytime soon. Even before the storm, child care centers faced financial struggles, a situation that unfortunately has only been worsened by Helen's destruction. In response to that, Governor Roy Cooper emphasized the importance of child care for storm-impacted families, rebuilding their lives, and urged the North Carolina General Assembly for more funding to address immediate and long-term needs. Governor Cooper's recent Executive Order 319, which grants regulatory flexibility for child care facilities, is allowing the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, DHHS, to modify rules to expedite reopenings. This aligns with existing support efforts and helps facilities recover safely while maintaining standards. The need for flexibility is heightened by the expiration of the Child Care Subsidization Grant, originally created during COVID-19. In partnership with child and adult care food programs, the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services aims to ease food access regulations to maintain nutrition access for children. Brian Bulford of the John Locke Foundation suggests that if temporary regulatory flexibilities can be eased in child care operations while ensuring that they are still safe and operational, they could be considered for permanent implementation to reduce burdens on providers and lower costs for families. Brian said, quote, Cooper's most recent executive order allowing for flexibility among one thing. Child care centers require an answer to these questions. If these flexibilities make it easier for child care centers to operate while still maintaining safety standards, why not make these flexibilities permanent? End quote. Brian Bulford is the VP of research at the John Locke Foundation. There has been other issues with child care facilities. As we talked about, they have lost a lot of these grants that came out during COVID-19. Many of these child care facilities noting that they might not be able to continue operation with losing that grant funding. Out of 200 damaged child care facilities, 55 of them unlikely to reopen soon, some of them likely to never open again. We'll get some additional details with Katie Zender from the Carolina Journal coming up a little bit later on this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:08 on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. The final home stretch of early voting taking place here in North Carolina today and tomorrow. Early voting wraps up Saturday across the state of North Carolina. To get an update on how the early voting period has broken down thus far, it's my pleasure to welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour this morning Andy Jackson from the John Locke Foundation. Andy, appreciate your analysis as always. Where do things stand here this Friday morning?
Hey, Nick, good to see you again. Well, I mean, the bottom line is that Democrats are still down compared to where they were 4 years ago in the 2020 election. Republicans are up a little bit, a little over 10,000. Unaffiliated's up closer to 30,000 compared to they were 4 years ago. But Democrats are still down by over 300,000 ballots. So 300,000 fewer Democrats have voted so far this year compared to the same point 4 years ago. So they're in quite a bit of a hole, and it's just, and part of it is due to registration differences. There are fewer Democrats than there were 4 years ago, but part of it kind of speaks to motivation, and there seems to be a lack of it on the Democratic side.
So with that, mentioned 2 days left of early voting today and tomorrow, it seems unlikely that Democrats can make up that lead. Typically the last day of early voting is one of the more popular days as you've tracked this day in and day out, updating CarolinaElections.com, do you think they'd take a shot at trying to overtake Republicans in this final stretch?
I really don't think that's going to happen. It's not in the cards, probably. I mean, unless we have a huge turnaround. And the Democrats have been eating into it. They were up. They were in the hole more than 350,000 a few days ago, and so 5,000 here, 10,000 there. They have been kind of knocking that back, and so it's an improved situation for Democrats compared to what it was, say, 5 days ago or a week ago. But the clock is running out. The other thing to consider is that, because we've had more Republican registrations have gone up, not as much as unaffiliated over the last 3 years, but they have gone up. So Republicans still have a lot in the tank, as they say, to have their traditional election day dominance. Now, there has been some cannibalization, especially on the Republican side. There are people that had in the past voted on election day, but now they're voting early. But that's in the single digits. And like I said, there's more Republicans than there used to be in the state. So they still have, plenty of room to grow on election day. So yeah, I don't think the Democrats are going to be able to make that up. They're really going to have to depend on the unaffiliated voters shifting their traditional voting patterns and going kind of heavy Democratic this year.
What is the likelihood of that as we look at those folks leaving and shifting around parties? You mentioned the Democrats have lost a lot of voters. Many of those folks have moved over to the unaffiliated group of voters here in the state. Do you think we see maybe a bigger break for Democrats by unaffiliated voters, even maybe a couple percentage points compared to years past?
I think it's possible. I mean, you have to look at the kind of folks that are unaffiliated. They tend to be younger, which is a group that tends to vote Democratic. There's a lot of unaffiliated that have risen in a lot of your larger counties, a lot of your counties with universities, for example. They're more unaffiliated. The Democrats in Orange County, home of UNC Chapel Hill, for example. So I do expect unaffiliated will do at least a little better for Democrats than they did 4 years ago. But, a 300,000 vote gap is a huge obstacle to overcome. And so they're going to have to put a lot of weight on counting on those unaffiliateds changing their voting patterns. And it's hard to see that it'll be that big a change. North Carolina is full of surprises.
It absolutely is, especially with that unaffiliated voter block. What is their percentages and what are their numbers looking like in the early voting period thus far? Are they same, up, down? What's going on with them?
Unaffiliated's up about 30,000. And the thing to remember is there's a lot more. Unaffiliated grew by over 400,000 from 2020 as numbers of people registered. So they're becoming, they're the single largest block of voters. They are now, so far in early voting, they are the second biggest block of people who have voted after Democrats. But they underperform on turnout. That's the other thing when you're depending on unaffiliated voters is, they tend to be like 10% lower than either Republicans or Democrats on turnout. And so, even though they're a huge part of the electorate, they don't really perform in voting to the degree that you would expect given how big they are in the electorate. So yeah, they're a bit of a sleeping giant in that case, and they just haven't woken up fully.
We'll continue the conversation with Andy Jackson coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's 5:13, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time to get a look at traffic on this November 1st with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. Good morning.
It's 5:17. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Encourage you to check out the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast wherever you are going, whatever time of day in your favorite podcast app. Search for the Carolina Journal News Hour or visit WBT.com and click on the podcast tab. Tracking some other statewide news this morning as we approach Election Day, things are heating up in the race for Superintendent of Public Instruction. Republican candidate Michelle Morrow has recently accused her Democrat opponent Mo Green of covering up a violent student assault while he was the superintendent of the Guilford County school system. In a press release earlier this week, Morrow shared statements from an individual known as Patricia Davis, the mother of the assaulted student, who claims that Green ignored her numerous attempts to address the incident. According to Davis, her son, then a freshman at the time, suffered a brutal beating at school, resulting in several facial injuries that required extensive reconstructive surgery. Despite the severity, the school allegedly delayed medical response, waiting upwards of 45 minutes for Davis to arrive instead of calling an ambulance. She reported her son bled profusely, even splitting up blood clots on the way to the hospital. Davis claims that Green, in an attempt to shield a friend, only imposed a 3-day suspension on the assailant and disregarded her repeated pleas for action. Additionally, she alleges that no incident report was ever filed and a mandated procedure which is required in these cases. Davis says she recently decided to come forward with her story after learning that Mo Green was running for state superintendent, fearing that his election could enable further incidents to go undressed. Morrow, who defeated incumbent Catherine Truitt in the GOP primary, has criticized Green's past affiliations, including his role in the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, a left-leaning nonprofit that opposes school choice initiatives. In response to this story and these allegations, of which I'll note are very serious, Green responded to Morrow's accusation in an emailed statement to Carolina Journal. He said, quote, "Students and parents must feel safe in our schools, and violence can never be tolerated." He continued by saying, "School safety is the top reason we can't elect Michelle Morrow, who not only lies about my record, but has called for the public execution of public leaders like Barack Obama and Roy Cooper, supported a military coup to keep a candidate in office, and wants to arm public school teachers. I've always worked to make our schools safe places where students can learn and thrive, and I'll remain focused on that critical, important priority." End quote. That's Mo Green, the Democrat candidate for school superintendent. Polling continues to show a razor-tight race between these two candidates, Michelle Morrow and Mo Green. That's one of the major races that we'll be tracking Election Day right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:21. Continuing our conversation this morning with Andy Jackson from the John Locke Foundation, taking a look at early voting stats and numbers across the state. Andy, in the last segment, you mentioned something that was brought up very early on in the early voting period. The RNC and the GOP and Trump's message this whole cycle has been bank your vote, get out the vote, vote early. He's been saying it in rallies all across the state. He said it earlier this week when he was here. And there was some idea that the traditional surge that Republicans have on Election Day would be essentially cannibalized by this early voting surge that the RNC and the Trump campaign have been pushing. As we set to close the door here on early voting, what is your analysis on that? Will Republicans essentially cannibalize their normal and large margins on Election Day, or are there still a lot of votes up for play?
Well, the bottom line is there's still a lot of votes in play. The cannibalization rate, like I said earlier, was in the single digits. So you're looking at maybe around 100,000-ish Republicans that had voted on Election Day 4 years ago are voting early. We also saw that Republicans who had voted early before are voting early this year. So they decided to shift that up a little bit, and they perhaps influenced by that whole bank your vote campaign. But yeah, the Republicans still have a lot in the tank. With their registration increase, they have enough available voters that they'll probably still pull in more votes than Democrats on election day. Will it be as dominant as it has been over the last decade or so? Probably not, with a little bit of that cannibalization, but it looks like it's still going to be there. So Republicans are probably feeling pretty good unless we have a real big turnaround among Democrats in the next couple of days.
We talked about that, and from your vantage point, there was not really a good way for them to make up those margins in the final 2 days of early voting. Have you seen anything, whether it's been online, rumblings under the surface, that Democrats are set to have a large turnout on Election Day, or is that something that Republicans are still likely to own as we look forward to Tuesday?
I haven't seen any rumblings. Now, I don't really have the pulse of the parties, but the Republicans have been very open with this whole bank your vote campaign, and considering how Democrats have traditionally dominated early voting, especially in the African American community, for example, with the whole "Souls to the Polls" campaigns from Black churches, I don't see them wanting to relinquish that traditional advantage that they had, because the nice thing, if you're with the party and people have already voted, you do not have to spend any resources getting them to vote. So right now, Republicans, relatively speaking, are in better shape than they were 4 years ago, because they don't have to spend as many resources making sure that people get out on election day. They're still going to have to, comparatively invest more than Democrats. And for Democrats, there are people who have voted before early who haven't voted yet. Now, are those folks that have decided for some reason, well, I'm not going to vote early, I'm not going to vote by mail this year, I'm just going to wait and vote on election day? I mean, that's always possible. I don't think it's likely in most cases. What we're really looking at is more of a depressed turnout. So the African American vote is down, I think, 1.5 percentage points in that range compared to the same point 4 years ago. That's obviously, given that they tend to vote Democratic heavily, somewhere in the range of 9-1, 90%, 85% in that range. That's another worrisome sign for Democrats, and they're going to have to expend their time and energy over the next few days trying to get as many of those voters out on election day, if not on the last day of early voting.
Well, another demographic that I've been keeping track of is the young voter in the state, ages 18 to about 25 years old. And while Republicans are up about 16-ish hundred votes or so, which in the grand scheme of 3.3 million votes, Andy, is not a large number. However, you look at both Democrat and unaffiliated voters that fall into that same age range, they're down 40,000 votes. That's a disaster for the Democrat Party.
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, it's been it's a reoccurring problem. I mean, all the target groups have been problems for Democrats so far this year, and again, I do find it hard to believe that they're going to be able to turn around and get those folks out on that last Saturday or on election day. Now, some areas, like for example, I think Orange County is doing pretty well. And presumably mostly for Democrats, but there are also other areas with young voters that are not doing quite as well, obviously. And the question is, what is the demotivating factor here? I mean, what is causing these students? I mean, certainly it's not a lack of ads. Certainly it's not a lack of contact, but because, folks, I mean, I have an 18-year-old daughter. She's moved out of state to go to school, but I get inundated with mailers trying to reach out to her and get her to come out and vote. And so the young people are getting hit, but for whatever reason, they're not responding.
Let me ask you quickly about that. I'm glad you brought that up. You're seeing in these mailers that you're receiving for your daughter, is the message any different than what you're seeing on television or on billboards, or is it essentially the same kind of catch-all net that's being thrown out by both Democrats and Republicans? Are they specifically talking to the youth in these mailers, or is it just kind of the same stuff that is unfortunately flooding everybody's mailboxes?
Well, there's a slight difference. I mean, the messaging, since she is a young woman, it's a lot on abortion, which you're getting a lot. And we happen to live in the suburbs of Raleigh, so we're also in that demographic as well. So she's getting hit on that a lot. since this is her first time voting. She's also getting a lot in a little bit of a creepy way. And I don't know if you've seen these ads on YouTube or whatnot, but they have these ads saying whether or not you vote is a public record.
Yeah, I
And
have
so
seen
she's been
those.
getting mailers on that, basically trying to shame her into voting. And I saw a study out of Colorado a few years ago that kind of shaming actually works. So far, at least, it doesn't seem to be working here and now, though, because, as you mentioned, the youth vote is down compared to 4 years ago. And we have more youths. I mean, North Carolina is a growing state.
Andy, for folks that want to dig into all of the data that we're talking about, keep track of early voting today and tomorrow, where do they go to keep up to date on that?
The best way to go is at Vote Tracker, which is at carolinaelections.com. And when you get on that landing page, you'll see an option for Vote Tracker on the left. Click on that and you'll see Vote Tracker. If you're interested in looking at voter registration changes and seeing how that's changed since the 2020 election, click on the right and you'll get our voter registration changes pages and you can set the dates.
A great resource, Andy Jackson. Thanks for joining us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's 528, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time for another look on this Friday morning on traffic with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, Nick, in North Charlotte, have police.
It's 5:34 on WBT. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour, also streaming live this morning on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. Republicans are raising questions about efforts to provide alternative early voting locations in one western North Carolina county that was hit hard by Hurricane Helene. A lawyer for the Republican National Committee and the North Carolina Republican Party sent a letter Tuesday questioning the resources available at 3 new alternative early voting locations in Henderson County. The letter requested an increase in the number of express voting machines at the early voting sites, stating that they were necessary to, quote, uphold the spirit and the letter of North Carolina election laws and to prevent unnecessary voter hardship, end quote. The Republican letter followed a meeting on Friday regarding the opening of 3 new sites at which the Henderson County Direction of Elections, whose name is Summer Heatherly, was reported in saying, quote, we will be doing the bare minimum, end quote, and there will be long lines. On the opening day of the sites, well, the letter stated that all of those sites did experience long wait times, lasting up to 2 hours in some cases, specifically at one location, the Fletcher Town Hall location. A spokesman for the North Carolina State Board of Elections defended the County Board of Elections' efforts in addressing the long lines by saying county staff pivoted and were able to shift resources to help reduce wait times, noting that wait times were significantly reduced by the second day of voting. Michelle Woodhouse, who is an NCGOP district chair and an Henderson County resident, said that this could have been avoided if the Democrat chair and the Henderson County Board of Elections director had done their job earlier. The opening of 3 additional early voting sites in Henderson County on Tuesday came after the state legislature had to pass a bipartisan bill requiring each county board of elections to open at least 1 additional voting location for every 30,000 registered voters in the county. The law only applied to those counties that experienced severe effects from Hurricane Helene. That would be about 25 counties out in western North Carolina. And according to Woodhouse and the North Carolina State Board of Elections, all concerns raised in the letter have been addressed. And the attorney attorney for the state board said Henderson County's election workers should be celebrated for their efforts to increase the facilities and to make this operate in this once-in-a-lifetime hurricane and this last-minute curveball that this new law imposed on them. So those additional early voting sites are open, probably to the chagrin of local election officials who didn't want to open them in the first place. It was the North Carolina General Assembly that made that happen after passing legislation. It's now 5:37 on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Continuing updates this morning out of western North Carolina, at this point now 5 weeks removed from the impacts of Hurricane Helene out in western North Carolina. Katie Zender from the Carolina Journal joins us this morning. Katie, you've got an update on childcare. We know that that's been a hot topic across the state well before the impacts from Helene, but now there's some additional challenges out west. What are you learning this morning?
Right. Hi, good morning, Nick. Thank you so much for having me on this morning. So out of 200 childcare facilities in the 25 counties that were impacted by Helene, 55 of those were so severely damaged that they will likely not reopen for the foreseeable future. Earlier this month, Governor Cooper signed Executive Order 319, which implements some flexibility for programs overseeing the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. And so part of what this order says is, quote, whereas to meet these critical childcare needs, the undersigned has determined that the Secretary requires authority to modify or waive enforcement of regulatory requirements as necessary. This refers to the Secretary of the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. And so basically what this does is implement some flexibilities to allow support and to allow regulatory flexibility to support these child care facilities and allow them to open sooner than they otherwise might be able to.
Well, for folks that have been following that saga, and I say saga, unfortunately, here in the state, Katie, a lot of COVID money was flowing into the state during 2020 and 2021, and a lot of that went to these childcare facilities, that spigot has been turned off. And there's been a lot of these facilities, as I mentioned, regardless of any natural disasters or anything like that, that have had to shut their doors due to this funding. Childcare is not only hard to come by, but it's incredibly expensive. It's one of the biggest budget busters for so many young families. I imagine this is going to create even more hectic and chaos out in Western North Carolina.
Right. So what you're referring to, Nick, is called the Child Care Stabilization Grant. This was a stopgap funding initiative that was started in 2021 during the COVID closures. And just last month in September, the General Assembly released the final payment of $67.5 million. This should fund the program through the end of the year. Governor Cooper is putting pressure on the General Assembly to continue this funding. We'll see if that, if the General Assembly decides to continue that funding or not. And so right now, the NCDHHS, the State Department of Healthcare and Human Services, is supporting child care facilities that are trying to reopen. So providing flexibilities that lack power, drinking water, wastewater treatment, or have lost records or paperwork that may make it difficult for them to reopen. So under the Emergency Operations Plan, which is developed under Healthcare Human Services, with a child care licensing consultant, the Department of Health and Human Services in the state can partner with this consultant to go over some of these regulatory influctuations that keep these facilities from opening.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up. For folks that follow North Carolina politics closely, over the last couple of years, there's been essentially a bare-knuckle boxing match between the General Assembly and Governor Roy Cooper over regulation and regulation of business and bars and restaurants and everything else. Kind of interesting, maybe even a little ironic to now see that Governor Cooper is the one that is calling for some government and bureaucracy and red tape to maybe back out of the way because of this obviously very important need out west.
Right. So I spoke with Brian Balfour. He's the Vice President of Research at the John Locke Foundation. And he basically said that, if we can roll back some of these regulations and allow for these flexibilities while still maintaining safe operating standards for these child care facilities, why not make these flexibilities permanent? He said, quote, "There's little doubt that these child care centers are weighed down with burdensome and often unnecessary requirements and regulations, which help to drive up the cost to families. Cooper should consider making these loosened requirements permanent to provide some relief for North Carolina families." That's what Brian Balfour at John Locke Foundation told me.
Well, and I guess it makes sense, Kate, if it's good enough to do in an emergency and the facilities are still going to be safe, they're still going to have food, water, electricity, heat, or air conditioning, depending on the time of the year. If they're able to operate with some of those regulations pulled back temporarily, I think that's a fair assessment to ask, why can't this be something more permanent and maybe something that the General Assembly looks at after the election they gavel back in January?
Exactly, Nick. And I think that we're seeing this is kind of one of the good outcomes of Hurricane Helene. We're seeing this in a lot of areas in the aftermath of Helene. We're seeing regulatory restrictions being rolled back. And so that could be one of the positive outcomes of the aftermath of Helene, is seeing some of this red tape rolled back in a lot of different areas, not just childcare.
Give us that top line number one more time for folks just joining us this morning. How many facilities are affected in this? It sounds like it's a large amount and could have a major impact.
So there's 200 in total across the 25 counties. Of those 200, 55 were damaged to the point where they're likely not going to reopen for the foreseeable future.
And tell us where folks can go and read more details on this story and check out all those different quotes.
Right, yeah, so they can read the full story on carolinajournal.com.
Katie Zender joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's 5:43, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time for another look at traffic this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
WBT.
Your emergency situation station.
Huh?
It's 5:47. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. You can also check out the Carolina Journal podcast. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour in your favorite podcast app or visit WBT.com and click on the podcast tab. Well, almost half of the North Carolinians have already voted during this early voting period. Through Thursday, more than 3.6 million, that's 46% of North Carolina's 7.7 million registered voters have already cast ballots. Today and tomorrow are the final days of early voting ahead of Tuesday, Election Day. Polling places will be open until 7:30 p.m. in most areas tonight, and 3 p.m. is the hard stop deadline on Saturday across the state. Now, it is important to note that locations vary by county, and hours can change for some locations as well. Looking forward to Election Day, polls open dark and early at 6:30 a.m. and will close at 7:30 p.m. As you're well aware, voters must show up at the polling place that they are assigned to, and they must be in line by 7:30. You can cast your ballot after, but you have to be in line by 7:30 to have your vote count. We will be digging into these early voting numbers throughout the weekend and give you really kind of set the stage coming up Monday morning as to what exactly we are going to expect coming up on Tuesday, Election Day, when we get those final early voting tallies. We'll also have continued coverage and details on our website, carolinajournal.com. Well, speaking of politics and elections, more controversy in the race for Superintendent of Public Instruction. Republican candidate Michelle Morrow has accused her Democrat opponent, Mo Green, of covering up a violent student assault while he was the superintendent of the Guilford County school system. In a press release, Morrow shared statements from a parent known as Patricia Davis, who was the mother of the assaulted student, who claims that Green ignored her numerous attempts to address the incident. According to Davis, her son, who was a freshman at the time, suffered a brutal beating at school, resulting in severe facial injuries that required extensive reconstructive surgery. Despite the severity of the incident, the school allegedly delayed medical response, waiting about 45 minutes for Davis to arrive instead of calling an ambulance as soon as the situation broke out. She reports that her son bled profusely on the way to the hospital. Davis claims that Green, in an attempt to shield a friend, only imposed a 3-day suspension on the assailant and disregarded her repeated pleas for action. Additionally, she alleges that no incident report was ever filed for this case, which is a mandated procedure statewide. Davis said that she recently decided to come forward with her story after learning that Mo Green was running for state superintendent, fearing that his election could enable further incidents to go unaddressed and unreported. Morrow, who defeated incumbent Catherine Trude in the GOP primary, has criticized Green's past affiliations, including his role with the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, which is a far left-leaning nonprofit group that opposes school choice initiatives. As you can imagine, Mo Green has responded to these allegations. He responded to Morrow's press release earlier this week in an emailed statement to carolinajournal.com. He said, quote, "Students and parents must feel safe in our schools, and violence can never be tolerated." He continued by saying school safety is the top reason that we cannot elect Michelle Morrow, who not only lies about my record, but who has called for the public execution of political leaders like Barack Obama and Roy Cooper, supported a military coup to keep a losing candidate in office, and wants to arm public school teachers. I've always worked to make our school a safe place where students can learn and thrive, and I'll remain focused on that critically important priority, end quote. That's coming in from Democrat candidate Mo Green. As we take a look at a variety of polls that have come out in the last couple of days, it shows a razor-tight race for Superintendent of Public Instruction. Essentially, most of these races show a tie or a 1-point lead for either candidate, depending on the poll that you're looking at. That race, just like many others in North Carolina, likely to come down to the wire, and it will be one of the main races that we are tracking election night over at carolinajournal.com. Taking a look at some other statewide news this morning, Hurricane Helene severely damaged some 200 child care facilities across 25 counties in western North Carolina. Out of those 200 that were damaged, 55 of them are unlikely to reopen anytime soon, some maybe never again. Even before the storm, child care centers faced financial struggles, a situation that was worsened by Hurricane Helene's destruction. And in response to this, Governor Roy Cooper emphasized the importance of child care for storm-impacted families that are attempting to rebuild their lives and urged the North Carolina General Assembly for more funding to address immediate and long-term needs in child care. Governor Roy Cooper recently moved forward with Executive Order 319, which grants regulatory flexibility for child care centers, allowing the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services to modify rules to expedite reopenings. This aligns with existing support efforts and helps facilities recover safely while maintaining a set of standards. The need for flexibility is heightened by the expiration of the Child Care Subsidization Grant, which was originally created during the COVID-19 pandemic. In partnership with the Child and Adult Food Program, the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services aims to ease food access regulations to maintain nutrition access for those children in child care facilities. Brian Bulford with the John Locke Foundation suggests that if these temporary regulatory flexibilities that are being put forward in this executive order can be done during this process while ensuring safety, that these should be considered for permanent implementation to reduce burdens on providers and lower costs for families. He said this, quote, Cooper's most recent executive order allowing flexibility for, among other things, child care centers requires an answer to this question. If these flexibilities make it easier for child care centers to operate while maintaining safety standards, why not make these flexibilities permanent? He said there's little doubt that child care centers are weighed down with burdensome and often unnecessary requirements and regulations, which helps drive up the cost for families. Cooper should consider making these loosened regulations permanent to provide some relief to North Carolina families. And this back and forth now over child care centers has been a constant struggle for the Cooper administration between them and the North Carolina General Assembly. Many of the major political battles that we have watched unfold over the last couple of years have been specifically over government, over regulation, over government red tape, and burdensome things that cause prices to soar and skyrocket as all of these tiny little boxes have to be checked to make, whatever, in this case, child care facilities, for them to pass everything that they need to open and to operate. And likely will continue to be a struggle depending on the makeup of the election on Tuesday and who wins the governor's race there. We'll continue to track that on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Republicans are raising questions about efforts to provide alternative early voting locations in one western North Carolina county that was hit hard by Hurricane Helene. A lawyer for the Republican National Committee and the North Carolina Republican Party sent a letter Tuesday questioning the resources available at 3 new early voting locations in Henderson County. There were reports of long lines and not enough quick access or express access voting machines at the location. According to the letter, well, some of those concerns have now been dealt with, according to the North Carolina State Board of Elections. Those 3 additional early voting locations in Henderson County will remain open today and tomorrow. As I noted, the final early voting day across the state is on Saturday at 3 p.m. Well, we are back Monday morning at 5 a.m. as we put a tight little bow on everything election related. If you're looking for more, I'll be filling in for Vince Coakley today, 12 to noon right here on WBT. Hopefully you can join me for that. If not, we'll see you back here Monday morning at 5. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. Have a great weekend.